Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's 4 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I just want to start by thanking you all for joining us today and welcoming you all to the Dibble Institute's second Wednesday webinar titled, What Do You Mean? Unblurring the Lines Between Consent, Assault, and So Much More by Keisha Parker. My name is Rachel here with the Dibble Institute, and we have behind the scenes the wonderful Kathy who keeps all of this kind of up and running for us.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad you're here.
So before we get into the webinar, I just want to go over some housekeeping items, including the phone number on the screen here and access code to use if you are unable or don't prefer to access the audio for the webinar through your phone. There will also be several ways to participate in this webinar. So we will have some poll questions during the presentation, and those poll questions will show up on your screen. When they do, you'll select your response by clicking on the bubble next to your chosen item. We'll also have a raise your hand question where you may or may not select the little hand symbol next to your name in the control panel after the question is asked. At the end of this webinar, there will be some time for Q&A with the presenter. So you will enter any of those questions you may have into the questions section on the panel to your right. But we do ask that you write down and save any of the content related questions until closer to the end of the presentation so they don't get mixed up with anyone who may be writing in with access related issues. Lastly, a few days from now, you'll be able to access the recording of this webinar at our website. We'll have the link at the end of the presentation, and I'll be handing this over in just a minute, but before I do, I just want to give you some background information on Dibble if you're new to our webinars. So this is our founder, Charlie Dibble, and his wife, Helen. Charlie was an engineer by trade, and as such, he sought solutions to issues. And about 30 years ago, he saw how young people's relationships and those of their parents were really affecting the outcomes of young people and not always in a positive way. So he began asking lead experts in the field of education what was being done to help young people develop skills to create these stable families, and things just kind of took off from there. So now the Dibble Institute continues his work by advocating for the effectiveness of relationship skill programming for youth and for young adults, and publishing research and evidence-based relationship education materials. So the Dibble Institute is a national nonprofit mission-driven organization, and we're able to reach many young people thanks to the efforts of you and many individuals and organizations partnering with us. So we couldn't have reached the 1.5 million youth and more that we have in the last 15 years without caring people like each of you. So just a big thanks to all of you here today. And next, I'd like to briefly highlight our core values. So the first one is that we believe in research. So that means we rely on current research to keep our materials up to date and relevant, which is why we're, releasing new versions of our curriculum. And next, we also believe in stable, healthy families of all different types. So research continues to show that children do best when raised with the healthy involvement of two parents, and that their relationship matters whether the parents are together or whether they're apart. But I'd like to point out that this doesn't mean that we are anti-divorce. We understand that not all families have two parents in the household, and research supports that complex, high conflict situations are not good for children. So we support stable and healthy families. This includes single parents, grandparents, adoptive parents, step parents, and extended family, all of which do great jobs and have great outcomes with their children. And we also believe that all people deserve respect and that all relationships can be improved with relationship skills. But for the real reason you all are here, we've got Keisha Parker, and she is the Community-Based Initiative Program Manager at the Georgia Campaign for Adolescent Power and Potential. Keisha earned a master's degree in public health from Armstrong Atlantic University and has over 8 years of experience working in the field of adolescent health and youth development. So now I'd like to go ahead and pass things off to our wonderful presenter, Keisha.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you guys are doing well. So before I start this webinar, and before we dive into the meat of today's webinar, I want to go through the learning objectives. So by the end of the webinar, we should be able to, 1, identify between 3 to 4 components of effectively communicating consent and sexual boundaries. 2, explain the importance of what consent is, what it is not, and why we should check in, as well as emphasize the importance of educating youth on their right to review sexual content. Next slide. So how big is the issue? Let's start off with some information regarding parents and guardians. So most people reported their parents did not talk with them about issues of consent and sexual assault. And if conversations did happen, they differed for daughters compared to sons. As well as survey participants reported that their parents were most likely to talk about health and unhealthy relationships, about 40%, and parents were less likely to talk about how to ask for consent in sexual situations. So this survey is a national survey that was done through partnership with Planned Parenthood, and that's where we're getting this information on. Next slide. So a little bit more data. Less than a third of people were taught anything at all related to consent, sexual assault, or healthy relationships in middle or high school. Among those that did receive some education, people were most likely to have been taught how to say no to sex in both middle, 25%, and high, 33%, and at least likely to have been taught how to ask for consent in both middle and high school. So many sexual and reproductive health curricula lack information related to consent and sexual assault and how to effectively communicate. If curricula do offer consent and sexual assault as a related topic, typically is only discussed in one lesson or section in the curriculum. I do want to mention something called Aaron's Law, and I'm not sure how many people are familiar with Aaron's Law, but there are 35 states that have passed this law, which requires that all public schools in each state to implement some type of prevention-oriented child sexual abuse program, which teaches one, students in grade pre-K to 12th grade age-appropriate techniques to recognize child sexual abuse and tell a trusted adult. 2, school personnel on about child sexual abuse. And 3, parents and guardians, the warning signs of sexual abuse, plus any needed assistance, referral, or resources. So again, it should be noted that this is typically up to the schools themselves of what this program should look like, but it's a start in regards to getting information about consent and sexual assault in the school systems. So this could be a good partnership opportunity for organizations like you. So what I do want to note is there are 15 states that have not passed Aaron's Law yet, and those are North Carolina, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Florida, Ohio, Kentucky, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, Hawaii, Arizona, Idaho, and Wisconsin. So those particular states, a lot of partnership is going to be needed. Next slide. So again, how big is this issue? I want to keep introducing facts about how big the issue is. So the survey also showed most people think that too little is actually being done to educate about sexual assault in high school and colleges. And an overwhelming majority of people support teaching how to ask for consent, how to recognize whether your partner is giving consent, and how to avoid sexually assaulting somebody in high school. So I would like to know if any of these facts mentioned up to this point have surprised you. So Kathy has a poll question set up. And so what I would like is if you guys could raise your hand to let me know exactly how many of you thought these statistics were surprising.
Yes, actually, the raise your hand, it's going to be beside your name. You'll see the little hand emblem. If you'll just kind of click in there for me, and then I'll be able to. Actually, a few people have said that some of the stats were pretty surprising, but it looks like majority of you obviously work in the field in one way or another with youth, and it's not so surprising. I'd say about 15% say it's surprising.
Okay, that's pretty low. You know, when we do webinars like these, because this particular topic is still pretty new to a lot of folks in the field, many haven't heard these statistics, so it's good that you guys are aware of how big that issue is. Next slide. So let's dive deep into the content now. So let's talk. Yes means yes. We are so used to hearing no means no when it comes to consent, which can be, but one of the major issues with no means no is that at times it creates a window of uncertainty. So for example, well, they didn't physically say no, so I thought they wanted it. When in reality, we know silence is no. It is also important to note that yes means yes. If you don't hear them say yes, in the famous words of Randy Jackson, it's a no for me, dog. So what is consent? What does it mean? It means all participants are freely choosing with clear understanding and mutual agreement to engage in a specific activity. So what I want to do now is take some time to kind of break that down a little bit further. So let's start with the beginning. All participants freely choose. That means they have the opportunity to say yes, the opportunity to say no, or the opportunity to say even maybe later. With clear understanding, are both parties capable of giving consent? And what does that mean? There are some categories in regards to when somebody cannot be capable of giving consent. So with first is the age of consent. It's important to know what the age of consent is in your law. I'm coming from Georgia, so as most of us in Georgia know, the age of consent for us is 16 years old to consent to sexual activity. So if somebody is under the age of 16 years old, they are not capable of giving consent. If they have developmental disabilities, so a victim who has been deemed developmental disabled or lacks the mental capacity to make ordinary judgments on his or her own, is unable to give consent to sexual acts. Physical disabilities, incapacity, or helplessness. A victim who is physically or mentally incapable of knowingly and intelligently giving consent to sexual acts is unable to give consent. So we want to kind of go into a little bit deeper. So one of the things that we get a lot of questions on is when it comes to drugs and alcohol. So for instance, you know, a lot of our youth will be like, well, I consented prior to drinking or prior to smoking or prior to doing drugs. Does my consent still stand? No. Once drugs and alcohol are introduced into the picture, consent is no longer given. So even if you were in a sober state of mind prior to, once those drugs and alcohol are introduced into the picture, consent is no longer able to be given. So again, with intoxication, a victim has the ability to temporarily cloud their judgment. So that's another reason why they aren't able to give consent. So lastly, to engage in a specific activity. The activity is specific and clearly stated, and it is known that you are able to withdraw if you want at any moment. So for us, consent means yes. You want that enthusiastic yes. It has to be clear and specific. All parties involved need to know exactly what is going on. There needs to be no type of miscommunication or misunderstanding. Both parties are capable of giving consent, which we briefly went over. And it's important to know that it's okay to be repetitive. If you want to repeat your consent or repeat your actions and things like that, that's fine. But again, we also always want to make sure that we're getting that yes. And again, always important to know you are able to withdraw if you want to at any moment. Next slide. So what is it not? And I like my little GIF here where he's saying, no, 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 kind of like the not in my house situation. So consent is not forced. That means no one should be made to do something they aren't willing or wanting to do. And typically when force is done, they're doing it through some type of manipulation or threat, blackmail, things like that. It should not be coerced, which means you're trying to persuade someone to do something that they don't want to do. And this is typically done again with threats or even blackmail. It should not be through fraud, which means that you are lying or pretending to be someone or do something in order to get what you want. And so then the last two, I kind of want to clarify a little bit about because these get misconstrued a lot. So when I say assumed and apply, a lot of people think they're the same thing. But when we talk about assumed and imply in these situations, assumed is just because we did something last week or we've done something before, it doesn't mean I'm okay with doing it this week. So for instance, we may have had sex 3 days ago, but 3 days later, I'm not wanting to have sex. So I cannot assume that just because I did something 3 days ago, 2 days ago, a month ago, that I'm gonna want to continue doing it today or even further on. Whereas when we are talking for implied, this typically goes in regards to relationships. So a lot of people imply just because I'm in some type of relationship with this person, whatever it may be, that I'm basically owed whatever it is I want. So for our young people, a lot of the times they're like, well, this is my boyfriend, my girlfriend, my partner, so they have to do what I want them to do. And that's not the case. And a lot of the times people even think just because I'm married to you that I don't need to ask for consent, when regardless of the situation, regardless of the relationship, you should always make sure you are asking for consent. Next slide. So what is sexual activity without consent? That would be considered rape. It would be considered sexual battery. It would be considered child molestation, non-penetrative touch, non-contact, or commercial sexual exploitation of children. So one thing that we want to mention is what each of these words constitutes really depends on what state you're from. So like I keep mentioning, I'm from Georgia. So rape, sexual battery, child molestation might mean something different in Georgia than it does in a North Carolina or in a Florida. So it's important to be sure to do your research and understanding what that means for your state and specifically your community. So for the most part, a lot of us know what rape and sexual battery is. So I'm gonna go a little bit deeper into the last four. So with child molestation, easily put, that's sexual acts with a minor. So somebody under the age of consent. For non-penetrative touch, some examples of those could be kissing. Again, there doesn't have to be any type of penetration. So it could be like kissing, groping, rubbing your genitals on somebody, etc. Versus non-contact would mean like you expose yourself to somebody, you send lewd pictures to somebody, you make someone perform sexual acts with someone else or by themselves in front of you. And then lastly, commercial sexual exploitation of children, which typically is referred to as trafficking. And what we're gonna do is, this is a pretty new sensitive topic for a lot of us. So I'm gonna dive in a little deeper with this one a little bit later on in my webinar. Next slide. So what does consent look like? It's an enthusiastic yes. And I don't mean you're screaming loud and proud yes, but you should know without certainty that this person means yes. It's checking in before, during, and after every sexual act. And this may not sound sexy, but it's important to do and be so that we can make sure we're on the safe side. You need to make sure that they're comfortable before even engaging in any type of activity, that they're okay with it. And then during, you need to make sure that they're still okay with it. And no, just because they consent to one position or one act doesn't mean in the middle of it, they're going to be consenting to that act. So if you want to introduce the new act, again, you need to make sure you're asking for consent. And after every sexual act, that should also be the case, just to make sure that they were comfortable and that open communication is still there. So sometimes what it can look like is it okay if we do this? That's how you can check in before. Are you still okay with us doing that? That's one way you can check in during. And were you comfortable when we blank is one way you can check in after the sexual act. So also consent looks like body language, and you'll see a little asterisk right next to body language, which I'll discuss in a second. But that can look like moving closer to your partner, kissing them more passionately, rubbing them more passionately or more hard. But one of the things, even though body language can be a form of consent, what we do want to consider is that we need to make sure that our young people are still asking for verbal consent and not just relying on body language, because at sometimes body language can be confusing. So you want to partner it with that verbal consent still. Next slide. All right, so let's talk about sex, baby. Who's ever heard of that song? Let's talk about sex, baby. This is kind of where I'm going with that. Let's talk about sex, baby. Let's talk about sexual boundaries between you and me. So sexual boundaries limits that a person identifies for themselves that are a reasonable, safe, and permissible way for other people to behave around them. Sexual boundaries are important to ensure one's personal space is protected. You and you alone are in control of your boundaries. No one may enter your personal space without your consent, and no one has the right to tell you what you are or are not comfortable with. It's important to communicate your boundaries when you seem fit or when your young person seems fit. And it's important that we teach our young people to state them firmly and respectfully and not feel like they need to justify themselves or apologize for the boundaries they are setting for themselves. Because again, this is what they deem appropriate for them to feel comfortable. So for instance, that we can use for young people, a couple is dating and they decide to try a new sexual act, but one partner is not completely comfortable about the act. So it's important to respect that person's boundaries for what they are willing to do, not willing to do, or if there is an alternate worth discussing between partners. So a lot of the times when we think of boundaries, we think of sexual boundaries. However, they can include, but are not limited to your own body boundaries, your personal space, your sexuality, and privacy in general. Next slide. So we talked a little bit about checking up on it, and I'm obsessed with Beyonce, so I have her little Coachella here, there. So when we check up on it, this is when I was talking about the before, during, and after. So here are some examples that I want to read to you that can be deemed as checking up on it. So 1, are you comfortable with me kissing your stomach? Can we try a new sexual position? I would like to try this. How does this make you feel? I know you were comfortable kissing, but can we move to sex or another type of sexual act? Let me know if this is too much. Are you not ready to do this? These are all ways that we can check up on it. And one thing we also like to kind of discuss is, what does consent sound like and what does consent not sound like? So some examples for what consent sounds like, of course, the yes, it's the keep going, it's the I like that, I love that. You're getting that sense of assurance that this person is okay with everything that you're doing. What consent does not sound like, and if you're and you should probably stop if you're hearing any of these, is the no, the maybe, because with that maybe there's still that uncertainty. If you hear any type of silence, that's definitely a no. I tell my young people all the time, no means no, means no, silence means no, maybe means no, means no. So these are all ways we can check up on it, and these are all sounds or things that we can say for what consent sounds like and what it doesn't sound like. Next slide, please. Okay, so I kind of want to do an activity with you, and this is called Did They Communicate? So Kathy is actually, she has a scenario for you. And so what I would like for you guys to do, and I'll read it out loud, is I want to know if they communicated consent in this specific scenario. So you're going to be given some options, and I want you to pick the option that you feel fits best in regards to did they communicate consent. So the scenario is, you're at a party with your friend when you both see your lab partner who you always thought was attractive. They've been drinking a little, so you go up and talk with them and see whether they might be interested in going somewhere more private. They agree, and so the both of you go upstairs together, where things go from talking to making out. So with the poll question, I want you to let me know whether or not they communicated consent.
I think there might have been.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to double click, but I did. I apologize. You're gonna have to discuss this, Keisha.
So there's a technology glitch.
Yeah, since it's in my fingertips.
Okay, no problem.
Sorry.
What we could do, I say, actually, what we could do really quickly, so we can get some kind of feedback. I can just kind of fill you in, Keisha. If everybody can find the little box that says chat on the control panel, you see it's at the very bottom. If you want to type in either A for the first one, yes, consent was clearly communicated. B, no, because the lab partner couldn't give consent. Or C, no, intentions were not stated prior to going upstairs. I can kind of give Keisha an idea of where people are falling in this. So if y'all want to take a second and respond into that chat box, not the questions box, but the chat box, I'll read those out. Oh, I'm getting them in the, they're coming into the questions box, so it's okay. Hold on, let's see.
Oh, okay, I apologize.
So no, this isn't, it's okay. So we have a lot, so there are not very many, there's no A's. I don't see, or I got a couple of A's I led. But it's mostly B and C. I would say people are pretty much leaning a little bit more towards B. If I could give some stats, I would say about 50% B, 40% C, and then a couple of A's.
Okay. All right, so the main thing here was consent was not communicated. So the reason why consent was not communicated, because as I mentioned earlier, once alcohol or drugs is introduced into the picture, consent can no longer be given. So because this partner had been drinking, regardless if they've been drinking a little or they've been drinking a lot, they still were drinking, and it still has the ability to cloud their judgment. So no, consent was not communicated correctly in this aspect. But also, again, it is a little bit of C as well, because they've been drinking. So they only asked if they were interested in going somewhere more private. It wasn't communicated what would happen when they did go somewhere more private. So again, that's where we fall into things need to be specific, and they also need to be clear when you're communicating what it is that you want to do and things like that. And then also things go from talking to making out. So with this one, it's unclear exactly what happened when they were talking. Did they discuss making out? But then again, the main picture here is consent could not have been given because of the fact that one of them had been drinking a little bit. Next slide. So what I'm gonna do, I actually have two more scenarios. And so what I'm gonna kind of do is I'm gonna read these scenarios to you, and I'm gonna explain, did they communicate consent in this particular activity? So this one is, person A says, send me a picture. Person B says, so send me a picture, and person B actually does send the picture. I know it doesn't say it in this one. And then the person says, no, I want a sexy one. So person B sends a sexy photo, and then person A replies, bet, I'm on my way. So this is another situation in which consent was not communicated. And this falls more in aspect to the bet I'm on my way over. So just because somebody's sending you a sexy photo, this person was assuming, okay, they send me a sexy photo, that means I can come over and who knows what's going to happen, or who knows what's on this person's mind. Again, we shouldn't assume that because something happens that we can decide whether or not consent was given. We need to make sure, hey, thanks for the sexy picture. Do you mind if I come over? Also, I'm assuming that these two are probably most likely in a relationship. So again, we can't imply because they're in a relationship that they're going to be okay with you randomly coming over to their house without them letting you know whether or not it's okay. So for this particular activity, this is also a no, consent was not communicated correctly. Next slide, please. All right, so Taylor, a 20-year-old college aide, has been assisting the men's basketball team at a local high school. When at a team function, one of the seniors on the team asked Taylor on a date. Taylor admits she has had a crush on the player and tells the player yes to the date. So in my head, I'm like, what's wrong with this? Taylor's 20, this guy's a senior, so most likely they're 18 years old. So, I mean, 20, 18, they're of consenting age for the most part. The issue with this one is consent is not going to be communicated correctly. And the reason why, and I didn't talk about this earlier, but it's also important to know, Taylor is technically some type of authority over this senior. She's working at the same school that this senior attend. And so based on the law, you cannot be dating somebody you are authority of, especially in that teacher-student type of environment. So consent can't be given in this situation, even though the two of them are of consenting age, because in reality, Taylor does have some type of authority over this high school student. And then also, I'm assuming he's 18 because he's in high school, but then we all know there can be some 17-year-old seniors, there can be some 16-year-old seniors. We just don't know their age. So for this particular scenario as well, consent was not communicated correctly. All right, next slide, if you don't mind. So I did mention that I would go in a little bit deeper about commercial childhood sexual exploitation as well as human trafficking. One of the things I want to mention, this can actually be a very touchy subject for a lot of people. So I always put the disclaimer out there. If you need to participate in any type of self-care as I'm talking about this topic, then by all means, please feel free to leave the webinar and take care of yourself. Also, it's important to note that I'm just going to give a very brief overview of what human trafficking and commercial child sexual exploitation is. We're not going to go too in depth with it because, to be honest, that can be a whole webinar on its own. And wink, wink, if Rachel and Kathy want to do that webinar, I'm all for it. But let's go into it just a little bit. So if you don't mind, next slide, please. So what is human trafficking? Human trafficking, it is the recruitment of a person by means of force or coercion for the purpose of involuntary servitude, aka work, or commercial sexual acts. There are two types of human trafficking, which is labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Typically, when we think of labor trafficking, that has to do with work. So a lot of the times when we think of youth, we might think of sweatshops, we might think of youth working on the farms or in, different types of factories, or they might be like young people who are applying for a job and it's advertised as one thing, but when they get there, it's something totally different. They're working more hours than they probably should and are getting very little pay. That's what we typically mean by labor trafficking. And then in regards to sex trafficking, that's basically trafficking for sexual acts. So you're getting paid in some type of way or form to perform sexual acts with somebody, with or without somebody. And it doesn't always, a lot of the time people think like prostitution and escorts and they think money. However, it doesn't have to be for labor trafficking or even sex trafficking. It doesn't have to be payment in the form of money. It can be payment in the form of clothes, a roof over your head, a meal, a cell phone. Payment can be in different types of ways. So according to some estimates, approximately about 80% of trafficking will be sexual exploitation, and the other 20% will involve labor exploitation. So again, I talked about labor trafficking on farms. They happen in nail salons. Sometimes they'll happen at shelters and things like that. However, we're going to move forward with sex trafficking. And so the definition moving forward with sex trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision of obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for a commercial sexual act in which that is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, and in which the person induced to perform such act has not obtained 18 years of age. So this is a little bit different. If for sex trafficking, if they are younger than, it's for those that are younger than 18 years of age. So age of consent is not applicable in this situation. Anybody under 18 years of age would be considered minor human trafficking in regards to sexual exploitation. Next slide, please. So it's important to understand traffickers. So traffickers use the violence, they use fear, they use threats, they use intimidation with their victims. And if you guys kind of remembered earlier when I was talking about consent, what it is and what it is not. We talked about consent is not forced. It can't be threats. It can't be using fear. It can't be using violence. You can't get consent when you use any of these things. So that's why commercial sexual exploitation of children is considered a form of sexual violence. Next slide, please. So before I move on to this particular slide, what I want you guys to know is a lot of the times we ask the question, who is a trafficker? What does a trafficker look like? And a lot of times people say, oh, the term they typically use for a trafficker is the pimp, you know, with the cane and the hats and the fur coats and the gold teeth. Typically they're males and they're old and they're very charming. They know how to get you to do what they want to do, how they like it. However, it's important to know anybody can be a trafficker. Women can be traffickers, young people can be traffickers, men can be traffickers, aunties, mothers, grandma, a lot of different types of people can be traffickers. So we need to move away from the stereotype that it's typically male and it's typically this little greasy looking person with his fur coat and things like that. A lot of the times when we talk to young people and we'll ask them to describe a trafficker, they're most likely getting their descriptions from TV and movies. So one of the things we like to do is we do this activity where we're like, guess who the trafficker is? And sometimes we'll show them pictures of ordinary people and they have a hard time trying to disguise like who's a trafficker and who's not a trafficker. So we need to make sure when we're educating young people that we know that anybody can be a trafficker and it's not these stereotypes that you typically see on media or in movies or in songs. So with that being said, I want to move on to this slide and we're going to do a poll question with it as well. But what I want to know is, where do you all think trafficking occurs?
I think I did a little bit better that time. Sorry. It launched a little bit easier. So anyway, if you'll take just a couple minutes, y'all, to put a plug in or put a click in where your answer is, then I'm going to be closing the poll and we'll share the results. There you go, Keisha.
Yeah, so a majority of you, 90% of you said all of the above. Yes, trafficking occurs in all of the above. It occurs in foreign countries. It occurs in the low-income neighborhoods. It occurs in metropolitan cities. A lot of the times, you know, the reason why we put questions like this is when I ask my young people, or I ask young people in general, where does trafficking occur? I mean, what do you think they're telling me? They're thinking China, you know, Asia, they're thinking Africa, they're thinking all these continents or different countries. But a lot of the times, nobody ever says the United States of America. Nobody ever says, typically no one ever says North America. But what we want young people to know and understand is trafficking occurs everywhere and anywhere. And can you go to the next slide? Because I'm not sure if I put this, if I gave this to you. I did. All right, so what I want to show you is sex trafficking statistics. So the Department of Justice has identified the top 20 human trafficking jurisdictions in North America. So about a pimp or a trafficker can make about 150,000 to 200,000 each year. And they typically will pimp out, exploit, or traffic about 4 to 6 girls. Now, we do know, even though this says girls, we do know that boys can be trafficked as well. So about 1 in 4 girls will be victims of trafficking or some type of exploitation, whereas for guys, it'll be about 1 in 10. So that's also something that we need to know, that it's not just girls who need to be worried about sex trafficking, but our young men need to be worried about it as well. This is a $1 billion industry, which blows on my mind and actually sickens me to my stomach. But 9.5 billion annually are how much human trafficking generate in the United States alone. That's not including other foreign countries. And about a third of teens on the streets will be lured towards prostitution within 48 hours of leaving home. For those that leave home, they kind of feel like they have no answers or no hope, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to make that money. So a lot of the times they get lured into this, prostitution ring type of situation. But let's take a look at the top 20. And as you guys can kind of see, all of the cities listed here are metropolitan cities. They're big cities in the states that they belong to. The issue with why these are probably our top 20, and you can guess for themselves, not only is it because they're metropolitan cities, but these cities probably have the biggest airports, probably the most sports types of arenas. As you can see, California is really big because that's around the border. And then once we get into the South, New Orleans, Atlanta, Miami, Charlotte, even Texas, those are really big because of their airports as well as their sporting arenas, but also because of cruise ships. So for instance, let's talk about Atlanta for a second. I'm in Georgia. So Atlanta, the Super Bowl was here a few months ago. So because of the arena of the Super Bowl and the lack of high-tech security, as well as the fact that we have Hartsfield International Airport, and we have the Braves Stadium. That makes us a really popular area for sex trafficking. And those are pretty much going to be the same reasons for a lot of these different cities and things like that. So for folks that don't really think sex trafficking happens in the United States, it actually really does. And even though it doesn't just, and now it is, we should note, it doesn't just happen in big cities, but the reason why we noted the big cities is these are probably going to be your biggest ones where it has lots of transportation. So you can still be trafficked in a smaller city, but most of these smaller cities are really close to an area that has a lot of routes for transportation, whether it be through air or through car or for boat. All right, next slide, please. So where does trafficking occur again? So a lot of the times we need to be mindful of social media, and we need to be mindful of the social media that our young people are using, because this is one of the biggest ways that they're using to target our children is through their social media. We actually just did a webinar and a presentation, and we asked adults in the room, how many hours a day do you think kids spend on social media influences? Nobody got it right, but the answer to that is 9 hours a day on some type of social media influence, whether that be Snapchat or Instagram or the computer itself, or any type of messaging app. They're spending about 9 hours a day. So that's where since they're spending a good majority, not a majority, but a good amount of time of their day on these social media apps, this is how human traffickers are getting them. So human trafficking has also been increased because of social media outlets. These predators, they're watching, they're listening, and they are creating fake accounts to friend these people. They're saying, they're looking at the social media because young people put their whole lives on these social medias. So what these predators are doing is they're creating these fake accounts. They're basically stalking young people, and they're like, oh, well, she's not happy with school, or he's upset with his parents, or he's having issues with that, or she's having issues with this. Let me be that person for them that they can talk to and trust. And so what they do is they use those vulnerabilities that these young people have, and they use it to their power to get to lure them into thinking this person is someone they can trust and that this person is not going to do anything to hurt them. So next slide, please. So again, who can be a victim of trafficking? Sorry, this one has an animation, so you're gonna have to keep clicking. Yeah, so average age of entry for human trafficking is between the ages of 12 to 14. And those that are most vulnerable for victimization are, again, the young, because average age of entry is about 12 to 14. Those who run away from home, A lot of the times they are victims because they don't have money, they don't have shelter, so they pry on this situation, and basically predators will give them the things that they don't have because of the fact they've run away. It's also going to be youth in foster care and foster care. And when we say what else, these are also going to be like children that are in low economic environments, children who may not have their parents involved in the situation, or they're going to be basically our high risk priority populations. So minorities, low income, those types of factors. All right, next slide, please. So incorporating sexual violence, whether it be in your school, whether it be in your organization, what it's important to know is we need to remain socially cultural relevant within the classroom and in the community when it comes to discussions. So what does this mean? This means incorporating both social and cultural relevant factors. Know what's going on in your community when incorporating sexual violence amongst young youth your age, because that's what's going to basically pique their interest the most. When you know what's going on in your community, when you can use real life examples of what is going on, that makes it more relatable. So again, what are, one thing I want you to think about are, what are the social and cultural factors that are in your communities? Do you even know what those are or what they even could be? Teaching comprehensively to include consent and sexual health education. As I mentioned before, a lot of these curricula don't involve consent, or they don't involve information about sexual violence. So we need to make sure we're finding curricula like Dibble has that it talks about consent, talks about sexual violence and things like that. Or we need to make sure we're partnering with organizations to bring that to our schools and to bring that into our communities. We need to make sure that we're constantly modeling consent within our youth setting. So what this can look like is, asking if it's okay to hug a young person, asking young people if it's okay to be in their personal space. I know, like, for example, when teachers walk around the room and they're looking over students' shoulders, or they're like, oh, tapping them on the shoulder, good job, Timmy, Johnny, Keisha, Allison, good job. We want to make sure we're getting their consent before we even do things like that. And it might seem so little, but it actually is a big thing that we model this constant consent within our young people. Being inclusive of topics that set forth the foundation of sexual violence prevention. And what the foundation is, one, we need to be educating people about boundaries, that they have the right to their boundaries, that they set their boundaries. We need to teach them what healthy communication is, not just about how do we communicate our words, but how can we be great listeners? Because again, communication is important when we are trying to communicate consent. We need to tell them what healthy relationships look like. What are characteristics of a healthy relationship? What are characteristics of something that's unhealthy, and what can be a red flag? And for those things that are a red flag, what can make a red flag go from, that's not a big deal, to, whoa, we're about to get into a very unhealthy type of situation. We need to let people know that not just no means no, but that yes means yes. And if we're not getting that yes, then it's going to be a no. We need to stop saying, oh, well, they look like they wanted it, or they didn't say no. Well, if you're not getting that yes, if you're not getting that enthusiastic yes, then no matter what, that's a no. And we need to help our young people identify what sexual violence looks like. And so that's why I feel like it's important that we make sure we know what sexual violence looks like when it comes to our state. When it comes to our state and when it comes to our communities. Because if we don't know what sexual violence looks like as an adult, how can we explain that to a young person? So, I want to kind of end on a note about resources. So here are some, these are national resources, because when looking at the roster, I noticed you guys were from all over. So these are some national resources that I have for you. So the first one is RAIN. It is the
Keisha, sorry, do you mind if I interrupt you real quick?
Go ahead.
I just want to make sure we're getting a little close with time, and I want to give people the opportunity to ask you questions.
Oh.
So I wanted to kind of open it up if you don't mind, because the great thing is this webinar, the slides will be posted. So people will be able to look these resources up that you have included on here for them. But like Keisha mentioned before we get into the questions, I did want to just note our newest updates of our curricula, Relationship Smarts Plus 4.0 and Love Notes 3.0, because like Keisha said, we have moved to include topics of sexual assault and consent in these new programs. And I know we discussed Aaron's Law a little bit earlier in the webinar, and I wanted to point out that there is an Aaron's Law toolkit on the Dibble program slide, because Love Notes is being implemented in Spartanburg, South Carolina to meet the requirements of Aaron's Law. So if anybody wants to learn more about this, let us know in the survey at the very end of the webinar, and we can share the link to the toolkit with you and answer any questions you may have. But now I want to, like I said, open it up so people can ask questions for you, Keisha, because this has been an amazing and very informative webinar. So I want to let people kind of have the opportunity to ask any questions they may have.
No problem. Thank you. And yes, away, please.
And Rachel, we might want to mention too, while people are writing their questions down, we did do a webinar on Aaron's Law, maybe the end of last year, the beginning of this year. I really can't remember. But anyway, you can find that in our archived webinars too. And it'll give a little bit more information.
Yeah, great point. Okay, so I've got a question asking any cultural considerations for how consent is communicated. So consideration for youth with impairments to communication. So a hearing person versus a non-hearing individual. So if you can kind of maybe speak to those cultural considerations a bit more, Keisha.
I'm sorry, repeat the question a little bit.
Of course, sorry. I think this person's just asking to kind of speak to the cultural considerations a little bit more about communicating consent, if you've got any ideas about that.
Oh, okay. So like cultural in regards to like race and ethnicity, or?
Sure. There isn't any, it isn't specific,
okay.
So.
Yeah, a lot of the times that kind of goes into like what I was saying in one of the last slides. When we want to be, in regards to cultural considerations, when you're teaching consent or talking about consent, you want to make sure that all of your examples are relevant to whatever that culture may be. So like right now, we're kind of doing something with a Hispanic population. So what we've done is basically when, communicating consent, and when we talk about examples and things like that, what we did is we researched what's going on in the Hispanic and the Latino population and use some of those examples to kind of illustrate what consent is. Also, a lot of the times when you want to be culturally appropriate, also having somebody from the community partnering with you to do these types of programs is also a really big thing. That's why it's like important to make sure you know what's going on in your community, who are your power players in the community, and just kind of knowing what organizations are already doing that work in the community, because that's going to make it really culturally and more community appropriate in regards to communicating consent.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I think you kind of started speaking to this a bit earlier, but about other kind of areas for trafficking to occur. So I know you discussed those larger cities and then briefly mentioned smaller cities and communities, but kind of pointing out where those other kind of high risk areas might be that aren't necessarily large cities.
Yeah, so the thing about it is the reason why we know so much information about the larger cities is because the trafficking is actually going on in the more smaller rural areas. But the reason why the bigger cities like Atlanta and Charlotte and Los Angeles, San Francisco, is because of the fact that they have most of the port systems and the transportation systems to get them out of the area. So typically what'll happen is most of the trafficking occurs in your more small rural types of towns, and they're basically using the bigger cities to transport them out because again, like you have the airports and things like that. So even though we're getting more traction with those bigger cities, it really is actually happening in the rural communities. So you're very small town, maybe no more than like a couple thousand people, you know, in the city. You have like only a couple schools, a couple stores, and things like that.
Awesome.
So,
Yeah.
Towns where everyone knows everyone.
So yeah, those smaller communities, and what someone pointed out, and I think you've touched on too, is like that closeness to highways. So that ability to kind of get people and go, if you will. Let's see. All right.
Well, one thing, like for instance, in Charlotte, they have a major highway in Charlotte that can take you to 3 different states.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, that's why they're using these bigger cities to get, you know, to get away with their trafficking.
Yeah. Okay. So we have someone who has a question about discussing alcohol and consent with young people. And they said, how would you respond if a young person said, well, what if I'm in a relationship and we have a couple of drinks and we both agree to have sex?
Again, you need to, well, one, we need to let the young person know they need to be 21 in order to be drinking. But again, we need to also let them know that regardless if you're in a relationship and you guys agreed on this mutually, this still can be considered a form of sexual assault, and it can be a form of, and it is a form of consent not being given. So unfortunately, even, you know, a lot of the times our young people are like, it's not that big of a deal, but in reality, neither one of you, regardless of the fact that you're both in a relationship, it doesn't matter. Once that alcohol is introduced, then consent can no longer be given. And I can kind of give a real life example. We've actually have had this story where these 2 people, they were in a relationship and went to a party, both had been drinking. And when they woke up the next, you know, like the next day, she like basically what happened was she accused him of sexual assault. She was like, and he was like, but we're in a relationship, it doesn't matter, like it doesn't matter. But still she was able to say he sexually assaulted her because she said she wasn't of the right state of mind. And so he went to jail for it. So again, we want to make sure that we're teaching our young people that you need to be clear of anything that can cloud your judgment. And it doesn't matter if you're in a relationship or not, consent still needs to be given.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Keisha. All right. So we're getting close to the end of time, and I just want to thank you again so much, and let people know kind of what's to come. But you put on an amazing webinar. We've got a lot of positive feedback too about people and how much they've really enjoyed this presentation. So thank you so much, Keisha, for all of your hard work with this and for doing this webinar with us today.
No, thank you. And again, I want to thank everybody for joining in. And Rachel and Kathy both have my contact information. So if you have additional questions or anything like that, please don't hesitate to send me an email.
Awesome. Okay, so I just want to thank everyone. I know Keisha just did it, but I also wanted to thank everyone again for joining us on today's webinar. So there is a brief survey at the end of this webinar, and we really appreciate it if you can take some time to respond to that, provide us feedback. And also, like I said, if you have further questions for us or for Keisha, or you want access to that toolkit, to take a second to fill out that survey, and we'll get back to you within the next week or so. This webinar will be available within 3 days. So if you happen to miss anything, or you just absolutely loved it and want to look at it again, we will post it on our website with Keisha's, a link to it on YouTube, as well as the individual slides, a PDF of the slides. Or you can directly contact Kathy at kathy@dibbleinstitute.org, or myself at rachel@dibbleinstitute.org. But we want you to stay in touch with us other ways. So you can check out our website or our Facebook, subscribe to our newsletter by texting DIBBLE to 22828. Like I said, like us on Facebook, follow us on LinkedIn, or just give us a call. And I want to invite you all to July's second Wednesday webinar called Chambers of the Heart, Building and Maintaining Trust and Relationships, with the Honorable J.H. Corpening. I hope I got that correctly. So we look forward to having you all again, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks again, Keisha.
Thank you.
Thank you.